So finally supporting Ruby 2.0 for the first time. Puppet's we had to support a whole variety of Ruby releases, and we're really looking forward to kind of dropping some of the earlier 1.8 releases and just supporting 1.9 and 2. One of the big problems people have often had with Puppet was we embed our own certificate authority, and support for interoperating with another certificate authority has always been a little bit spotty. It worked for a while, and then we had a security fix we had to push out that we actually had to disable support for it. Now we've really formalized it. So for those of you who are already running an SSL CA of some kind, we fully support doing things like having a root CA that issues an intermediate certificate for your Puppet certificate authority, and then it can then go and issue other certificates. We support a bunch of different scenarios there, but I know this has been a pain point for a whole lot of people, particularly if you're already running like DogTag or one of the existing PKI solutions. We're really looking to make our support better for that. In many ways, I feel like Puppet should kind of get out of the SSL business, and we should try and hand off as much of that as to projects that really specialize in that as possible. So we're really looking at people who are running DogTag along with Puppet. If any of you guys have come across that, it's a really good Fedora project. So another thing I'd really love to talk to people about. If you're running an external CA, I very much want to talk to you. We also released in this release an experimental future parser. One of the problems we've kind of had with Puppet is that because it runs your infrastructure, people want it to be stable. They don't actually want behavior to change all that much, but they want the things they don't like to change. And everyone has a different subset of what that is. So we've borrowed a leaf from Python where you can import things from the future. And this is the first feature you're going to see where there's a future. We're not actually promising that in the future this will be exactly like this, but it's a way you can turn it on a case-by-case basis for your production infrastructure and examine, see where this feature is going. So you'll see a few things in the parser that are quite big changes in behavior for Puppet, but this is something we really want to get feedback on. So you're going to see more and more of these things where we can kind of turn on future features that are in somewhat of an experimental state on a case-by-case basis in your stable production release. We added slow catalog profiling. I think if you're running a large Puppet infrastructure or even just a small complicated one, you can often start off, performance is fine, and then as you expand and start doing more and more, it becomes really unclear why things are slowing down. So this was a really great commit recently for the 3.2.0 release that allows you to turn on profiling when you're compiling catalogs, either with Puppet Apply or for your Puppet agents, and you can actually see where time is being spent. And we're finding, particularly as people are moving to the cloud, certain things that seem pretty quick on bare metal and with fast storage attached, once you get to unreliable cloud scale storage, they can get a hell of a lot slower, particularly functions and calling higher data stores or reading data can just be quite slow, and it's been difficult to actually work out whether that's the case in the past. We also added support for OpenWRT as an OS, and I think this is awesome. So I've been kind of hacking on Linksys routers since the first GPL fiasco with Linksys, and just DDR, WRT, and Tomato, and OpenWRT. We can have Puppet on these things. So I have this dream at PuppetConf this year of trying to do a mini data center that's just all Raspberry Pis and OpenWRT routers. See, that would be awesome. We also added a modulo operator to the DSL. This is a really tiny thing, but we found that a lot of people were using inline template just for this. And it's just the math operator modulo. Divide two things and get the remainder. So it turns out for whatever reason, this is something ops people need to do a lot, whether it's like assigning IPs within a block or working out some little bit of functionality. So we've added it straight to the DSL. Who's running Puppet on Windows? Who didn't know Puppet ran on Windows? Who thinks this is a terrible idea and Puppet should never work on Windows? So to be fair, we're not aiming this at people. We're not looking to displace Microsoft and SCCM and that whole ecosystem. And Puppet's roots have always been in Unix, and Unix likes and Linux. But the reality is, we find a whole bunch of people who may be 99% Linux, 99% Unix OSs, but they've got 3 Windows boxes they just have to manage for whatever reason. And especially in the cloud, it becomes really heavyweight to roll out AD or any of that stuff. And Puppet's actually really nice on Windows. I think it was a really good validation that the model we built for Unix OSs was portable enough to move to like quite a different OS and still be really functional. When you can actually do things now like manage registry keys and values with Puppet. And I'm not a fan of the Windows registry. I think there's all sorts of problems with monolithic databases like that. But it turns out when you're managing it with Puppet, it becomes a hell of a lot more pleasant. So here's the future parser. So we can set parser future either on the command line or in a config file. And you'll see we've been focusing this mainly around iteration and enumerables. Who was using the Ruby DSL with Puppet? Okay, so the Ruby DSL hasn't been working really all that well with Puppet. We sort of found that Puppet's always been really extensible with Ruby. You can write functions, you can write facts, you can write report processes, you can even delve into the indirector if you really, really want to. But people really wanted to be able to munge data better within the DSL. And I think a bunch of the attributes of Puppet, like not being able to overwrite a variable that's within scope unless there's a bug, have made it really hard to do things like that. So even if you write functions to merge and manage and split all this data, you end up creating like 5 or 6 intermediate variables and you just end up with this horrible bit of functionality. We actually found that most people who are using the Ruby DSL really just wanted to munge data more effectively. And they wanted to use all Ruby's abilities around string processing in particular. And we found that most people were actually wanting to loop over something. They were wanting to build up a hash based upon data collected from different areas. They wanted to then just pass that through to create resources. So we decided to focus the DSL and the future parser around iteration. So if any of you have used code blocks in Ruby or lambdas in other languages, this should be pretty easy to see. We've got an array with 3 items in it. We use each to loop over it, and we pass through the code block where we notice the value. So this is a really good way to be able to collect data from Hira, from various different data sources, and then just iterate over it and enumerate it. We've shipped a whole bunch of functions that make this easier: each, splice, collect. And I think particularly with the collect, this is the sort of thing people are doing in the Ruby DSL. Iterating over a collection of things, checking a condition and returning a resultant map. So very keen to see what people think about this. And it's really easy to just turn on a case-by-case basis. The other problem we kind of had with the Ruby DSL was we started to feel it was starting to fork the Puppet community. And we didn't really want to get to a world where lots of people were writing manifests that weren't necessarily readable by the rest of the community. This actually came out of the Puppet Armatures program. And armature, I believe, someone was being clever here, is the scaffolding on which a puppet or mannequin is built. But really this is our enhancement proposal system. Much like PEP in the Python community or JEP in the Java community, we wanted to get to a better way of people being able to describe non-trivial functionality they wanted to get into Puppet and have a discussion based around it. So we decided to use GitHub as the platform for this. So if you go and check out this repository, you'll see it's full of markdown files that are people's proposals for non-trivial changes to Puppet. So you'll see things like this experimental parser. You'll see some competing proposals where people are looking for sort of a more Puppet DSL-like, slightly less Ruby-like way of doing the iterations. We've got some proposed changes to the execution model. So this is very much not just for Puppet Labs developers, but for everyone in the community. If you're interested in seeing what people are thinking about where they would like Puppet to change, things that they would like to see implemented, head to the armatures and you'll see we have quite a good process around that. How to propose an armature, how to work on getting it polished and accepted and pulled into the project. We don't talk about Factor very often, and it's funny because Factor kind of underpins all of Puppet. But we just released 1.7 and this has some really awesome functionality in it. External facts. So one of the big challenges I've had in previous deployments is I worked at Google, which was very much a Python shop. And so no one wanted to write a fact in Ruby. And sometimes you don't actually even have the APIs you need. Like if you think about being on like Mac OS X, you might want to write a Cocoa Objective-C fact because those APIs are there and the Ruby bindings are crap or unsupported or whatever. So we've got a facts.d directory if you're running Puppet Enterprise. It'll be an etc Puppet Labs factor. If you're running open source, it'll be an etc factor. And any executable on a Linux or Unix box will just return a fact. All you just need to do is spit out key value pairs, and those will be used as facts. So you don't have to drop to Ruby anymore. You can even write your facts in Java if you really wanted. On Windows, we've got a few more restrictions. They've got to be COM, exe, batch files, PowerShell files. And again, on Windows, this was really useful because people didn't necessarily want to write Ruby bindings for everything, because PowerShell actually has quite a lot of stuff accessible to it. The other nice thing is that we actually support structured data in that directory. So if you have some other process that like dumps a bunch of JSON or YAML, or even simple key value pairs in a text file, those are also accessible as facts. So you might have some other completely different process, something may be part of your provisioning process that you're just baking into the image, and now you can just drop data files on your machine and those will be accessible as facts. So I think this is actually a pretty exciting release. Given lots of people didn't know about mCollective, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. mCollective is our orchestration framework, and it's even more frameworky than Puppet is, if that makes sense. It's really built around an orchestration model. You have a message queue, all of your nodes subscribe to it, and you can pick subsets of your machines and get them to do stuff. It's very much built around structured data in and structured data out. So it's not just like running SSH in a for loop. This is about so you can indicate what conditions for success are and get really great overviews when you execute a command, which nodes succeeded and which ones didn't. 2.2 brought network discovery, made network discovery pluggable. Traditionally with mCollective, we basically broadcast across the message bus. Anyone that responded was a node that we were talking to. Now we can actually pick external sources. You might have a CMDB, you might have some ENC that you can query, a node database somewhere, you might talk to Remedy, whatever you're running. We can now have really simple plugins that are the source of truth for what nodes exist in your deployment. We added functionality to allow you to summarize your results well in the DDL. So the DDL is the descriptive language for writing an mCollective plugin. And now you can specify how results should be summarized when they come back. We'll see a few examples of that. And we added shell completion support. mCollective's command line driven. There's some really nice Z shell and bash extensions in the mCollective source. And you can, if you install those, you can automatically tab complete for available plugins, parameters, values, etc. One of the biggest things in 2.2 was a new Puppet agent plugin for mCollective, which confusingly enough is an mCollective agent for the Puppet agent. This is kind of powerful enough that I think it's worth talking about as if it's an application in its own right. Once you start using Puppet to manage your infrastructure, it's really good at managing everything else, but your Puppet deployment can get to a point where it's complicated enough that you want to manage it as well. And the Puppet agent for mCollective lets you do that. So we can orchestrate things. We can talk to a subset of our nodes and go, I'd like those of you who've got the web server class assigned to you to run Puppet now. Or I'd like you to disable. Or I'd like you to run in no-op mode. I'd like you to run with these tags in this environment against a different Puppet server. So you get all this control over execution of the Puppet agent across your infrastructure. And we're really finding, actually this is good, how many of you are running Puppet scheduled out of cron or a demonized agent? How many of you are running it on demand? Okay. Who's using Capistrano to do that? Funk? Those of you who aren't using mCollective, what are you using? SSH? Ansible? You're using Ansible to trigger Puppet runs?
Not really.
Okay. Because that's feeling a bit Inception-y to me. Like, I'm sure you could do it. This is the. So we're really finding people are sort of moving away from having Puppet just automatically run every 30 minutes or scheduled out of cron. They're starting to just run it on demand. I think partly because we're moving to a world with more dedicated machines where there's less likely to be users interactively logging into the boxes and breaking them at regular intervals. And people are tending to only run Puppet when they've actually got a change they want to deploy. So the Puppet agent for mCollective works really, really well for that and allows you to just orchestrate. I've just pushed something to my version control repository that's on the masters. Now I'd like this subset of nodes to run. If that succeeds, let me expand the deployment. The other nice thing the agent lets you do, the mcollective Puppet agent, is throttle the number of simultaneous runs. So the Puppet master is a finite resource, and if you've got a really large deployment, you need to push a change out quickly. It can be frustrating to kind of work out where's the actual level, the number of runs I can simultaneously do, wait for those to finish, and queue up more. So with this, you can do really simple things like go, I'd like everyone to run, but no more than 10 of you at a time. And it'll just sort of successively run through batches of nodes until they're all complete. Here's a summary example. So you can see for our 28 nodes here, we get this nice sort of overview of how long config retrieval took. You can sort of pick hotspots for performance in your infrastructure, and you can get a really good overview, all on the command line. We can also do things like run Puppet resource. So normally Puppet's about taking a desired state and ensuring that's the state on a given machine. But we can also do more interesting things like look at the state of a resource on the machine and tell us what it looks like to Puppet, or ad hoc create a single resource. So what we're doing here is we're looking at all the machines that are set to have the role web server associated with them. So that -w means that class is associated with them. And we're creating a host entry on them for the host called DB with that IP address. So this becomes a really, really simple way to just perform quick fixes and quick changes across your infrastructure and get a really nice overview of the nodes that succeeded and the nodes that failed. We can also do things like this. Everyone makes mistakes at some point. I had a running joke, I think, when I was at Google that Puppet let me break more machines more quickly than any other tool I'd ever used in my life. And so you can do things like this. You can go, oh my God, someone pushed something bad, or there's a package update that's going to break something that's being pulled in with an ensure latest or whatever. And we can add a message to it and go, we're disabling Puppet on all of these nodes with this log message. And if someone goes to run Puppet, they'll get that message come back at them. One of the really cool things you can do then, you can see with Puppet and mcollective, is we can then enable it, and it can enable selectively. So here, we're calling a function with mcollective to go, we only want to enable the nodes that have a disable message that matches this regular expression. So you can even start to do that. So if you're sort of in a disaster point, you can go disable everyone for this reason, selectively enable some nodes once I've fixed those particular issues. Who's running Puppet DB? Who doesn't know what Puppet DB is? It's okay. So Puppet DB for us is a way to store all of the information that Puppet generates as part of its run. Puppet kind of needs to know all this stuff. It collects all these facts about your operating system. A catalogue gets compiled that has all of the resources and all of the attributes for those things that you're actually managing. And so Puppet DB started for us as a way to put those catalogues into a database. Who's running the old active records store configs for exported resources? You should move to Puppet DB as fast as you can. We're going to deprecate the active records store configs. Puppet DB just operates so much faster. It's really, really quite unbelievable. So this for us was a big change too. This is our first non-Ruby program we've released. So it's written in Clojure and runs on the JVM. And for those of you who hate Java, try and distinguish your hatred for Java from the JVM, because the JVM is quite a beautiful piece of technology. And we're really happy with Clojure. It's been really good for us with data concurrency and throughput. And it's not that Ruby is inherently slow, but we just found that Clojure was a really, really good fit for this sort of project. We've added facts to it. So the old inventory service, that API is all fully compatible with Puppet DB. So that you end up with this database now that has all of your catalogs, so all of the resources you're managing, all of the facts, and we've just added all of the reports as well. So report storage, the API is not as fully fleshed out as a lot of the other stuff, but it's all there. And because they're structured objects, you can query them and get bits and pieces of them back. You can do all sorts of cool things here, like go, show me all of the nodes via an API REST call that have this resource declared on them. Show me all of the nodes that have this fact with this value and have this class associated with them. So you can start to really introspect your Puppet environment and get really useful info out of it. This for us is sort of a move where we're trying to get Puppet to be more of a service-oriented architecture. We want to move it so that people who are building GUIs and various tools for Puppet don't necessarily have to own all of the data themselves, but can start consulting various services that we can then scale out horizontally or vertically, depending on what kind of service it is. Puppet was getting a little bit too monolithic, we were finding, and so we're starting to try and break things up into standalone projects that can kind of run at their own release schedule. So yes, this is the overview you get from the status page on PuppetDB when you're running it, but highly suggest you have a look at the API because it's pretty interesting. Who's used the Puppet Forge? Okay. Who's uploaded a module to the Forge? Okay. Who would upload more modules if you could automatically send them from GitHub to... GitHub guys can put your hands down. Do you use GitHub? Occasionally. That's what I thought. So the Forge is our repository of community modules. So one of the goals with Puppet was always to make sure that we could produce reusable chunks of infrastructure. We didn't want everyone writing all the Puppet code for themselves all of the time, because you don't have to. You want to pick the person who's the Apache specialist or the person who's a specialist in whatever bit of software you're trying to run. Let them kind of create a higher level, easier to use abstraction and sort of so you don't have to worry about the details. So the Forge has a whole bunch of modules. I believe we've actually just broken 1,000, and I should have updated that for April. So we formed a dedicated team in the last year, and that made a really big difference. We've now got dedicated product and engineering people on the Forge, and it's significantly improved. So if you tried the Forge like a year ago and thought it was pretty crap, because it was pretty crap, then it's not crap anymore. So as you can see, huge amount more users. It's been really great to see this ecosystem around people creating accounts on the Forge, uploading modules, and we really want to try and work out how we're going to expose that more and more. You'll see we launched a Q&A Stack Exchange-like site called ask.puppetlabs.com, and for those of you who've been finding the mailing list getting a little bit unwieldy, because we have, I think, 5,000 plus people on it now, the traffic's immense. I can barely keep up with the Puppet user mailing list anymore. The IRC channel has like 1,000 people on it, which can get pretty unwieldy at times as well. So we want to try and make sure that across all of these premises, like ask.puppetlabs, on the Forge, we work out some way for people to be able to promote how much they know about Puppet. So that when you go and look at the Forge module, you can say, well, that's that person who's answered 500 questions really usefully on the Q&A site, or the person who's reporting a bug in our bug tracker. So it's really quick for us to be able to go, well, that's a brand new user who's having this problem, or this is a report from someone who's been running Puppet for 5 years, has created 20 modules that are really popular. I think all of this stuff's going to be really useful. So we also just released 2.8 of Puppet Enterprise. Who runs AIX? It turns out there's not many of you, but the people who actually run it care a lot. So we added full support for Puppet M Collective to AIX. So you'll see that both in the open source project, but we've tied it all together really well in the enterprise product. As I mentioned before, what we do is we take all of the open source components and the community versions, and we kind of tie them together in one bundle. Like it's easily packaged, we provide the full Ruby stack. So that's the big virtue of the open source, of the enterprise product. We've got a few extra little things in there that are proprietary, like some VMware integrations. But really, that's the version you can get support and services from. That's the version that is really reliable. You've got one stack that you don't have to worry about. What Ruby version you're running, everything's really tested there. Who's using Razor? Who had no idea what Razor is? Excellent. So Razor is a partnership we've done between Puppet Labs and EMC, and it's based around provisioning. And the goal was originally to try and get some of the flexibility of cloud provisioning for bare metal machines. Because there's a lot of people who are sort of crafting their own Kickstart, Cobbler, whatever sort of setups to do bare metal provisioning. But it's not always easy to sort of introspect that as a model. I've definitely found I've written enough Kickstart scripts that are confusing as hell for anyone else who has to come along and read them afterwards. So Razor lets us do rule-based provisioning. So again, we're using M Collective here, so we can We have all of the machines automatically boot into a microkernel, and you can create rules like go, if it's a machine that's got an Intel processor and has more than 8 gigs of RAM and has more than this much storage attached to it, then put this image onto it. If this other rule applies, then put another image onto it. And you've got this sort of central console where you can see what machines are currently waiting re-imaging and what machines, based upon a rule change, should be re-imaged after their current workload. It's not quite ready for prime time yet. We really appreciate everyone who's running it, but we're not at a 1.0 release yet. So we're still running in the 0.9. We've got one of our dedicated senior engineers on it. So we really love getting more and more feedback on Razor and just work out what direction it should take. Because we get asked regularly about provisioning. Because I think often config management's your biggest problem, and then you roll out a system that actually lets you manage all of the machines, and then your next biggest problem becomes how do you create those machines really quickly. So we had 27 Puppet camps planned for this year. I think this may be up at around 29 so far. Lots of them working with partners, people like Netways. Google hosted our recent one in San Francisco. And it's been kind of amazing. You guys are a reasonably advanced crowd. We're finding that a lot of the Puppet camps, about half the people are actually new to Puppet, which is just kind of mind-blowing that we're seeing this sort of growth in the community. As you can see, yep, we're up to 5,500 people on the Puppet user list. The developer list is exploding. That's not even tracking all of the work that's going in GitHub with all of the interactions going on there around development. And the IRC channel, I'm pretty sure, is over 1,000 people now. Did anyone go to PuppetConf in the US last year? Okay. So we're still running lots and lots of Puppet camps like this event in Europe, but our big annual conference is in the US. We've had Puppet Camp Amsterdam has been a big one in the past, but we've been really concentrating on PuppetConf. PuppetConf is a big event. This year it's at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco. It's this awesome, beautiful venue. So we would love to see as many people from overseas as possible come along, and you can check out everything at puppetconf.com. I just had to change this because Joe Rett, who some of you might know from the mailing list, actually put out Instant Puppet 3 Starter. And there's a really good review of it at the moment on everythingsysadmin.com. And Tom there kind of talked about it as, it's like having a Puppet expert over your shoulder. So for those of you who are a little bit beyond the sort of beginner stage of Puppet and have some idea of what you're actually doing, this is a much shorter, more focused book, giving you sort of well-worn advice from the mailing list, from IRC, about the best way to do things. And I think one of the things Joe did really well here was that he actually just picked one OS for all of his examples. So it all becomes really, really readable, and you can get a sense of what's going on really, really quickly. So awesome little consumable book. The one in the middle, Nan Liu and Dan Bodie, both sort of long-time Puppet users, put this together. Writing types and providers has always been a little bit of a black art. We had a certain amount of documentation there, but especially when it comes to things like writing a package provider, there's a whole bunch of convention in the code base that hasn't always been as documented as well as it should. So this is another really great book. It's not huge, but it's really focused on how to write great types and providers. And if you've never even thought about writing them before, it's a really, really good place to start. John Arundel's Puppet 2.7 cookbook has been doing really well too. I think he basically sat on the IRC channel for 6 months and just asked people whether he could use their answer in his book. So if you don't like IRC and you prefer it in book form, the 2.7 cookbook probably does well for you. If you haven't been involved with the community, I mean, I know you guys are all here at the Puppet Camp. I don't know how you all sort of came here, but we have a really great community for interacting with. And it doesn't just have to be code review. I think one of the things that a lot of people don't always realise with open source projects is just how much other work there is to do. Documentation, triaging, just helping giving more information to a bug report. If you come across something in the bug tracker and the description's perhaps incomplete and you've got a better understanding of the issue, add your information there. Join in on the mailing lists and IRC. Check out the ask.puppetlab site. We really, really like this one because I think one of the problems we're having is the community had grown to such a size that historical knowledge was starting to be difficult to maintain. If someone ran into an obscure problem, someone else gave them a really great answer, that was kind of lost in the archives, because it turns out with all of the, even searching Google's archives, it's not always that easy to find these things. And so we very much took a leaf from Stack Exchange and the Q&A sites, and it's a website just focused around asking questions and having the best answers float to the top. Just even logging on and, voting up the best answers is a really big help to the rest of the community. And you can always go check out our community page for more information. Who's done training or is certified with Puppet? And who didn't know we had certification for Puppet? Okay, so we kind of did this for two reasons. One was we're finding that employers were asking us a lot, going, how do we tell whether someone's any good with Puppet? And somehow the answer of you should interview them wasn't necessarily good enough. We very much built the training and certification program and trying to make it as real world as possible. We're not looking for paper certifications here. We want people to have a way that they can indicate they do know about Puppet. And we don't want the training to be mandatory. We tried to very much benchmark all of the certifications so that if you're an experienced, advanced Puppet user and you know everything, you don't have to sit the training to do the certification. We've been running it all over the world. Hopefully this slide will look even bigger next year. And we've got two main tracks. I think we end up splitting up our training. Our advanced classes used to always be focused around both extending Puppet and managing it at scale. We've kind of split those two things up. So you've got more of a sysadmin focused track and more of a developer focused track. So if you're really looking into ways to really extend Puppet using Ruby, the training on that is really, really excellent. Writing custom report processes to interact with other systems, facts, all sorts of extensions for Puppet that aren't always the easiest to get started on, particularly if you haven't been a developer before. And so both of those flow through to Puppet and Advanced Puppet certification. Puppet Labs has been growing quite a lot over the last year. I think when I first joined 2.5 years ago, we were at about 20 people in an office so small that I had to timeshare a footstool with someone. We hit 50 odd people beginning of last year, and now I think this number is actually 134. I think we hired 2 people in the last few days. So it's been really great seeing this much growth. If any of you are ever in Portland, drop by the Puppet Labs office. We'll happily give you our Wi-Fi and a place to work and a place to drink our coffee and check out the office. We're very fond of the new office. As you can see, we went from 9,000 feet to 25,000. Just before we moved office, we were almost at footstool time-sharing point again. And here are some totally not staged, happy photos of Puppet Labs employees. And we're hiring. We're hiring like crazy, which is why we keep growing. These are most of our positions. We've got them all over the place. If you're interested in coming and working for us and you see a job description that says Portland, send us an email if you're not willing to move. We're very much trying to work out how to expand and get better at being a company who has lots and lots of remote employees as well. So if you're curious about a position, we're very much trying to get the best people, and we're not going to be particularly dogmatic about where you have to live. We're definitely trying to build the company in Portland, but we recognise not everyone can move, particularly if you live overseas. And this is my son as a ninja, and this is the only ninja we need because we don't hire rock stars and ninjas. Anyone have any questions?
Questions? Can you repeat the question?
I'll repeat the questions.
What's the status with IPv6? Is anyone here running IPv6?
Yep. So the question was, what's the status of IPv6? And is anyone here running Puppet with IPv6? Who's having... Well, I will ask the one person who answered the front row. Is it working?
Yes.
Yeah? So there are some issues. We're very much looking to make that a focus over the next few months. I think the Puppet 3.3 release, we've got a bunch of IPv6 stuff slated for it. I think we'll see, now that Factor 1.7's out, our next big push is going to be for structured facts. And if any of you have ever struggled with like a reasonably complex networking environment and Puppet's idea of the default IP address and the default MAC address, it can get kind of complicated. People who haven't sort of run multi-home networks will be like, well, it's the Ethernet address or the IP address, and it's not always the simplest thing in the world. And I think IPv6 support is going to improve as we build out more structured data around. We want a networking fact that splits via interface. Rather than just returning IP address, you want to be able to ask, what's the IP address for this particular interface, without just relying on the convention of underscore interface name. So we've actually handed over, the question was, sure. The question was about the future of Puppet Dashboard as an open source project. And we've actually kind of handed over responsibility for that to Aaron Stone, I believe his name is, and we've been working really closely with him. So the latest release, I believe, adds the parameterized class support in the dashboard, but it looks like it's going to continue on as a healthy open source project. We were very much trying to work out how we could continue to behave ethically with having commercial software and open source software, and we decided to try and make the split, producing great services and try and let the community come up with open source graphical interfaces, and we would sell graphical interfaces for ourselves. I don't know if you guys saw, but we put out an announcement to the user list a while ago saying that this is what we wanted to do with the dashboard, and Aaron stepped up and came on as a maintainer. Someone should ask a long question while I can get this.
Long question, please. I can't hear you because he's not able to repeat now. For a longer time.
You can drink your water a bit there. So I saw you had a job opening there for a VMware Alliance Manager, and you recently had a healthy infusion of cash from VMware.
Yes.
So can you tell us a bit more about the partnership that you have with VMware and
Sure.
what you're going to be doing?
So who runs the VMware stack here? Who's running vSphere or vCenter or vOps or v everything? Okay, so there's a lot of you. So you probably, from my point of view, I think there's definitely some gaps in the automation capabilities of the VMware stack. There's still a lot of stuff that's very sort of GUI driven and not necessarily easily automatable. And that's what we're working on a lot with VMware. Trying to work out how we can do the software-defined data center, to pick the buzzword that's running around at the moment. I think at the same time though, one of the strengths as Puppeter has always been that we're really heterogeneous. We don't really play OS favorites. We work in all sorts of cloud environments. So at the same time, we're trying to make sure that our special relationship with VMware isn't something that dominates all of our other efforts. So I realise that sounded like an awful non-answer. We're going to be doing a lot more work with being able to create nodes in the DSL. So I think you're all using Puppet to manage quite primitive objects like files and users and packages and services. And we've got a bunch of modules on the Forge and other places that let you kind of step up an abstraction and manage like Postgres databases or firewall rules or grant rules on tables. We're going to keep going up there and defining whole nodes in the DSL. If any of you saw our Google Compute integration, that was all based around that. So you could create Google Compute nodes in Puppet manifests. So I think you'll just see us doing more and more of that, of like speaking to virtualization environments. As far as I can tell, there's not actually anywhere near as much private cloud as there is virtualization that calls itself private cloud. So I think that's where we're going to see us, filling in the automation gaps in many, many ways. And it's been really good working with VMware so far, and I expect it to continue. But yes. But we have other investors. We have Cisco and Google both invested as well, and so we're not going to just be focusing on things like VCE and the VMware stuff. We're working pretty closely with Cisco I believe they just talked in the last week too about how Puppet's now going to be able to be installed as an agent on the Cisco NXOS switches. I can never work out whether that's Nexus or... But that's going to be really, really awesome. So I think Puppet moving on to other devices. We've had the Puppet device model inside Puppet for a while that let us proxy commands to things like iOS devices. But I think actually having Puppet running on your switches, like Cisco are doing and like Juniper's just released on the Forge, if you're running Juniper switches, you can, and I think you need 1204 of the Juniper Junos, you can actually go and download a whole version of Puppet that runs on your switch. And I think that's going to be a really, really interesting sort of world where, because network engineers have slightly different problems to systems engineers, but they also seem to be behind in terms of automation. I feel like sysadmins kind of crossed that bridge 5 years ago and went, you need to automate. You need to sort of be somewhat of a programmer. And I still see a lot of network engineers doing runbooks by hand, like running a 7-step process because that's what they feel more comfortable with. But I think we're going to see networking stuff get more and more software defined, whether it be software defined, whether it be networking in software or on the switches themselves. Sure.
Is it possible to scale out the Puppet masters to different hosts rather than scale up?
Yep. So the way most people I see actually do it was if you're running bind or something, you just use DNS views so that different areas resolve to a different Puppet master. But you can actually load balance Puppet just like any other HTTPS traffic. So you can just stick a load balancer in front of it. You can have DNS views that sort of resolve to different masters. A really common pattern is the one that I've set up in the past, which is each data center or each physical location has a DNS view that redirects to a local VIP, a virtual IP, and then that's a load balancer with like a pair of Puppet masters behind it. So there's a little bit of work you have to do if you want to have them all be able to access the Puppet master with the same address. But it's called the DNS alt names when you're setting up the Puppet master so that you can say, even though this box's name is Nigel, we're addressing it as puppet.mydomain. I want to create a certificate that can fill both purposes. So yes, we should have a pretty good scaling guide on the docs website that goes through this. But really just treat it like any other HTTPS traffic. The only difference is that you've actually got client identification as well as server.
So last question, someone?
I remember a question that was asked yesterday in the introduction to Puppet, and that what are there for best practices for the architecture of a Puppet setup?
Okay.
That guide is quite good, but the higher level, there's not that much.
Yeah, do you mean things like how do you lay out your module paths and have version control set up so different teams can contribute code, that sort of thing? Yeah. So I agree. I don't think we've necessarily nailed the best practices there. I think the Instant Puppet 3 book has a bunch of stuff in there, and you'll see definitely focused around PE. We've got a bunch of stuff in the deployment guide there, and a lot of that applies to the open source community versions as well. But I don't think we've necessarily formalized it. And part of the problem is that Puppet's it's kind of a how long is this piece of string problem because people are using it quite differently in different environments. But I agree, I think one of the big holes in our documentation is how to lay out your module paths and version control system so teams can work on Puppet, particularly if you're somewhere where you've got a division between the people who manage the infrastructure layer, like the OS, and then the people who manage the services, and they're all writing Puppet code that kind of interacts with each other. But yeah, I'd be happy to chat more about various different ideas.
Okay, then, thank you very much.